Jack Nicholson, the face that terrified the world in The Shining, electrified hearts in Cuckoo's Nest, and redefined madness as the Joker. For decades, he was untouchable, a storm of genius, chaos, and desire. But today, at 88, the legend who once ruled Hollywood is a ghost of himself, hidden in silence, consumed by heartbreak and whispers of decline. The tragedy of Jack Nicholson is darker than any role he ever played. What could be more heartbreaking than growing up believing your mother was your sister, and your grandparents were your parents? That was the cruel truth Jack Nicholson carried. Born in April 1000, 937-inch Neptune, New Jersey, his very life began under a shadow. His mother, June, was just 17, too young, too fragile to raise him. His father's identity was never revealed, leaving a void no fame or fortune could ever fill. To hide the scandal, Jack's grandparents took him in and introduced June as his older sister. On the surface, the household seemed ordinary, even warm. But beneath it was a deception so heavy it would one day shatter his entire sense of self. When June left to chase her own dreams, the boy who thought she was his sister never understood why she disappeared. That absence cut into him, not with hatred, but with aching confusion, a wound far too deep for a child to name. For decades, Jack lived without knowing the ground beneath him was a lie. Then, in 1974, when he was already one of Hollywood's brightest stars, a Time magazine reporter uncovered the devastating truth. The woman he thought was his sister was actually his mother, and the parents he adored were his grandparents. It wasn't just a revelation. It was collapse. Nicholson himself called it a hell of a dramatic event, a blade across the soul that never healed. Imagine learning that the foundation of your entire life was built on silence and shadows. Many would have been broken by it. Jack, instead, carried the wound forever, turning it into a fire the world could never look away from. The rage, the sorrow, the endless confusion, Jack refused to bury them. Instead, he transformed that wound into art. In the madness of The Shining, the defiance of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the twisted charm of Batman, you can feel it. Every glare, every line carried the voice of a haunted child whispering, "Who am I? Where do I come from?" That unanswered question became his power. His eyes burned with both fire and grief, giving his performances a depth no training could ever create. Out of silence and betrayal, Jack Nicholson forged the kind of brilliance that would echo for generations. What makes Nicholson's story extraordinary is not only the pain, but the resilience born from it. He refused to let abandonment define him. He would not collapse under secrecy. Instead, he turned confusion into creativity, grief into greatness, wounds into timeless art. Later in life, when asked about the revelation, he admitted the pain, but spoke with a steel calm. It was dramatic, but not traumatizing. I was already psychologically formed. In that paradox lies his truth, scar and strength, fracture and flame. From the very darkness that marked his childhood, Jack carved the brilliance that changed cinema forever. At just 17, Jack Nicholson left behind the broken identity of New Jersey and stepped onto California soil with nothing but hunger and grit. His first job wasn't on a set or under lights, but as an office boy at Hanna-Barbera, delivering scripts, fetching coffee, watching the magic unfold from the sidelines. He later joked, "I always knew I was meant for more than carrying coffee." But beneath the humor was the fire of a young man determined to break through. By 21, he finally landed his first role in Crybaby Killer, 1958. The low-budget film was forgettable to history, but to Jack it meant everything, proof he had crossed from dream into destiny. Crybaby Killer may have put Jack on screen, but it didn't make him a star. The film sank quickly, dismissed as a cheap B-movie. For most, it would have been the end. For Jack, it was the beginning. The next decade was brutal, stalled auditions, doors slammed shut, survival through writing. He even scripted the psychedelic film The Trip, 1967, and worked tirelessly with Roger Corman on shoestring productions. These forgotten films became his training ground. On cluttered back lots and smoky sets, Jack learned to improvise, to pull intensity out of thin air, to fight with nothing but raw will. He later confessed, "I never had it easy in this town, but I never stopped showing up." That stubborn resilience was what separated him from the thousands who quietly gave up. Then came 1969. At 32, in the countercultural masterpiece Easy Rider, Jack erupted onto the screen with a performance so alive, so unpredictable, that audiences were transfixed. Overnight, the office boy who once carried scripts became the man every studio wanted. That role was more than a career break, it was ignition. The hunger, the rejection, the scars of his youth all exploded into fire. His grin, his raw energy etched themselves into a generation yearning for freedom and rebellion. Hollywood could no longer look away. For Jack, it was proof that the pain he carried wasn't just personal, it was universal. And now, the whole world could feel it. From the moment Easy Rider hit, Nicholson's rise felt unstoppable. At 33, Five Easy Pieces, 1970, earned him his first Oscar nomination, and 3 years later, The Last Detail, 1973, brought another. Each role captured the restless, wounded spirit of America in an era of upheaval. Then came 1975. At 38, Jack's performance as Randall McMurphy in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest didn't just win him his first Academy Award, it carved his name into history. Critics called it electrifying, audiences wept, and Nicholson himself admitted, "Every actor is haunted by something. If you're lucky, you turn it into something people can feel." The world saw triumph, but Jack knew it was pain, transfigured into art. In 1980, under the relentless vision of Stanley Kubrick, Nicholson descended into madness as Jack Torrance in The Shining. His improvised line, "Here's Johnny," burned into pop culture forever. Audiences saw pure terror. Nicholson later admitted he had drawn from shadows already inside me. That's what made the performance so magnetic. It wasn't just acting. It was his own darkness spilling onto the screen. With The Shining, Nicholson didn't just redefine horror. He redefined what it meant to lose yourself to the abyss and take the audience with you. By the late 82nd, Nicholson wasn't just an actor, he was an institution. In 1989's Batman, his Joker was wicked, explosive, unforgettable. The role didn't just terrify audiences, it reshaped blockbuster cinema. And with a record-breaking $60 million payday, Nicholson bent Hollywood to his will. At 52, he had conquered the industry on every level, critical, cultural, and financial. Yet even at this towering peak, the hunger inside him was far from satisfied. In 1997, at 60 years old, Nicholson delivered one of his most tender performances in As Good as It Gets, a role that earned him his third Oscar. 12 nominations, 3 golden victories. His place among Hollywood's immortals was sealed. On stage, he joked with charm and wit, his speech shimmering with humor. But behind the grin lay something more fragile. Friends whispered of his loneliness, of a man adored by millions, yet often left restless and alone when the curtain fell. It was the cruel paradox of Jack Nicholson. The brighter the spotlight, the deeper the shadows inside him grew. For all his fame, Jack Nicholson married only once to actress Sandra Knight in 1962. She was graceful, warm, a brief anchor in the chaos of his young career. A year later, their daughter Jennifer was born, and for a fleeting moment Jack believed he had broken the chain of abandonment from his childhood. But the same fire that made him unstoppable on screen proved uncontainable at home. His restlessness, his relentless pursuit of art, slowly eroded the marriage. By 1968, just 6 years after their vows, it was over. There was no scandal, only quiet heartbreak. For Jennifer, it meant growing up without her father's steady presence. For Jack, it was the loss of the one chance at ordinary happiness he would never reclaim. In 1970, while his career blazed with 5 Easy Pieces, Nicholson's private life took a darker turn. With actress Susan Anspach, he fathered a son, Caleb. For most men, a child brings healing. For Jack, it became another fracture. Whether out of fear, uncertainty, or the consuming demands of fame, Nicholson kept his distance. Publicly, he did not acknowledge the boy. Privately, silence grew into a shadow that lingered for decades. Susan carried the role of parent alone, while Jack, who once suffered from family secrets himself, repeated the very cycle of absence that scarred him. Years later, he admitted softly, "There are things I wish I had done differently." 7 words heavy with regret, proof that even legends can falter at the most human role of all, being a father. In the mid-1972nd, Nicholson's path crossed with Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. Their connection was brief, but it carried a sorrow that never made headlines: the loss of a child before life had even begun. At the time, Jack's career was blazing with Oscar nominations, yet behind the curtain he endured a private grief few ever saw. For Michelle, it was anguish. For Jack, it was another fracture in his fragile dream of family. He rarely spoke of it, but those close to him noticed the weight it left behind. A man celebrated for bringing stories to life had been unable to protect the one life that might have bound him closer to love. It was not scandal, but silence, and in that silence lived one of his most human tragedies. If Nicholson's romances were storms, then Angelica Houston was the hurricane. For nearly 17 years, from 1973 to 1990, she was not just his lover but his equal, elegant, fierce, and unafraid of his chaos. She saw Jack not as a legend, but as a man, flawed, restless, brilliant, and vulnerable. Their love dazzled the public, yet behind closed doors it was scarred by temptation and betrayal. Houston later confessed in her memoir, "I was often humiliated, but I loved him." For years, she endured the cycle of tenderness and heartbreak, hoping love might outweigh chaos. But in 1990, the bond shattered. Nicholson fathered a child with model Rebecca Broussard, and for Houston, that was unforgivable. Nicholson himself admitted with rare pain, "I lost the best woman of my life, and I never forgave myself. It was the deepest wound of all, a love that burned brightest and broke hardest." After the storm with Angelica ended, Nicholson found a new chapter with model Rebecca Broussard, nearly 3 decades younger. To him, she seemed like a second chance, a chance at the family he had always longed for. In 1990, at 53, he welcomed daughter Lorraine, and 2 years later, son Ray. For a man haunted by absence and regret, their arrival was both joy and redemption. He often called them the best production of my life. Yet the same restlessness that destroyed past loves returned. Hollywood, fame, and temptation made permanence impossible. By the mid-1992nd, the relationship quietly dissolved. Rebecca gave him the children who became the pride of his later years. But she also marked the end of his final real shot at building a lasting home. Once again, Jack was left with love for his children and an empty house. After Rebecca, Nicholson's love life became a carousel of fleeting romances. In the mid-1992nd, whispers tied him to supermodel Kate Moss. Soon after, he shared a fiery, on-and-off relationship with actress Lara Flynn Boyle, followed by brief sparks with Paz de la Huerta in the early 2000s. To the tabloids, these affairs painted him as Hollywood's eternal rogue, too magnetic and untamable to ever be tied down. But behind the flashbulbs, the truth was lonelier. Each romance was lightning, dazzling, dramatic, impossible to ignore, and just as quick to vanish. With every flame that faded, Nicholson's private world grew quieter, heavier, and more haunted by the love he could never hold on to. When you step back, a painful pattern emerges. Nicholson fathered 6 children with 5 women, yet never found a lifelong partner. The one love he admitted losing, Angelica Houston, the best woman of my life, remained his deepest scar. Around that wound clustered other tragedies: the unborn child with Michelle Phillips, the silence with Susan Anspach and their son Caleb, the fleeting family with Sandra Knight, and the broken promise of permanence with Rebecca Broussard. Nicholson later confessed, "There are things I wish I had done differently." A single line, but weighted with decades of regret. For all his triumphs, love and loyalty were the battles he never won. By the early 2002, the man who once embodied chaos and rebellion began to retreat. At first, it was subtle, fewer roles, fewer appearances. Then in 2013, it was final. Jack Nicholson, the giant of his age, slipped quietly out of Hollywood with no farewell performance, no standing ovation. Whispers filled the silence. Memory loss, dementia, the sharp mind that once devoured entire scripts now fraying at the edges. For fans, it felt like a living death. The storm that once shook cinema had vanished without a goodbye. Rumors soon hardened into fear. Friends whispered that Jack no longer recognized familiar faces, that conversations slipped through his grasp. By 2017, actor Peter Fonda confirmed what many dreaded: Nicholson had quietly retired. There was no grand farewell, no last role to seal his immortality. He simply vanished, like a candle extinguished. For a man who defined himself by becoming others, disappearing without applause was its own tragedy, a curtain falling in silence. In his twilight years, Nicholson lives behind the guarded walls of his Mulholland Drive mansion. 6 children bear his name, yet none share his home. The great loves Sandra Knight, Michelle Phillips, Angelica Houston, Rebecca Broussard, all gone. Neighbors speak of faint lights at night, of Jack sometimes glimpsed on a balcony, shoulders hunched, eyes distant. For a man who once drew the world to him with a single grin, the silence now feels crushing. This is the cruelest paradox of all. On screen, he was immortal, but in life, he faces the same fate as anyone: frail, uncertain, alone. Even in seclusion, Nicholson's empire remains staggering: a net worth of nearly $400 million, mansions in Malibu, Shasta County, and Hawaii, and an art collection valued at more than $150 million, featuring masters like Picasso and Matisse. His garages hold Bentleys and Mercedes, symbols of a man who once had it all. But none of it can soften the silence of his home. The fortune, the masterpieces, the luxury, they stand as monuments not to triumph, but to absence. Jack Nicholson, once surrounded by crowds and lovers, now keeps company only with his wealth and his memories slipping away. To measure Nicholson only by decline is to miss the truth. Beyond heartbreaks and solitude, his legacy remains vast and undeniable. He wasn't just an actor reading lines, he reshaped them, leaving fingerprints on cinema itself. Off-screen, he collected art, supported causes from AIDS research to children's foundations, and quietly gave back. His life was messy and luminous, proof that greatness is not the absence of weakness, but the courage to turn pain into art. Jack Nicholson climbed a Hollywood summit, but he also showed us the fragility beneath the legend. The storm has faded into a whisper, yet that whisper endures in every role, every line, every glance that seared itself into memory. Jack Nicholson may have stepped away from the screen, but in the hearts of those he moved, he remains eternal.